Ace Frehley set his guitar down on the stage floor, walked off without a word, and the crowd didn't realize who was crying until 30 seconds later. The venue was the Beacon Theater in New York City. October 1987. A solo show. No makeup. No pyrotechnics. Just Ace Frehley and his guitar, playing to a crowd that had come to hear the man behind the Space Ace persona. The set had been moving smoothly. Ace never said much between songs, he didn't need to. He let the guitar do the talking. That's what people came for. Not speeches. Not explanations. Just the sound that had defined a generation. Halfway through. Shock me. Ace stopped playing. Not a dramatic stop. Not a thrown pick or a slammed hand on the strings. He simply stopped. His fingers lifted from the fretboard. The amplifier hummed. The crowd fell silent, confused, waiting for him to continue. Ace bent down slowly and placed his Les Paul on the stage floor with the same care a parent might lay down a sleeping child. Gentle. Deliberate. Final. Then he stood up, turned in profile toward stage left, and walked off. No wave. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the 3,000 people who had paid to see him. The crowd sat in stunned silence. 30 seconds of pure confusion. Was this part of the show? A technical issue? What was happening? And then someone in the front row, a man in his 50s wearing a faded Kiss tour shirt from 1977, put his hands over his face and started to cry. Not quiet tears. Deep, body-shaking sobs that cut through the silence like a knife. The people around him turned to look. Then others noticed. Then the whole theater seemed to understand that something had just happened that went far beyond a concert. Ace didn't defend himself. He never did. To understand that moment at the Beacon Theater, you need to go back 6 hours earlier. To a small dressing room backstage where Ace sat alone, tuning his guitar before the show. There was a knock on the door. Ace looked up but didn't say anything. He never invited people in with words. You either came in or you didn't. The door opened. A man stepped inside. Late 50s. Balding. Wearing that Kiss tour shirt under an old jacket. His hands were shaking. Ace Frehley? The man asked, though he clearly knew the answer. Ace nodded once. Kept tuning. I'm Richard Morrison. I wrote you a letter 6 months ago. I don't know if you got it. Ace's hands paused on the strings for just a fraction of a second. Then continued tuning. He remembered the letter. He remembered all the letters, even the ones his management said he didn't need to read. You probably don't remember. Richard continued, his voice thick. It was about my son. Danny. He was your biggest fan. Ace looked up now. Said nothing. Just waited. Danny died last year. Car accident. He was 17. Richard's voice cracked. The last thing he listened to before he left the house that day was your solo album. On repeat. He'd been learning Rip It Out for months. Almost had it down. Ace set the guitar aside carefully. Stood up. Still didn't speak. I wrote you because I wanted you to know, Richard said, tears running down his face now, that your music meant everything to him. That when he was bullied at school for being different, for being quiet, he'd come home and put on your albums and feel less alone. You taught him that being quiet didn't mean being weak. Ace stood there, hands at his sides. His jaw was set. His eyes were focused on Richard but carried a weight that suggested he was seeing something beyond the room. I brought his guitar pick, Richard said, pulling a worn pick from his pocket. He used it for every song. I was wondering, this is stupid, I know, but I was wondering if maybe you could play something for him tonight. Just one song. It would mean... He couldn't finish. Ace took the pick. Held it in his palm for a long moment. Then he looked at Richard and nodded once. Richard started to thank him, but Ace held up one hand. A gesture that said enough? Not because he was annoyed. Because words had already said everything that needed saying. What was his favorite song? Ace asked. The first words he'd spoken in the entire conversation. Shock me, Richard said. Ace nodded again. Front row tonight? Yes, sir. Be ready. That was the entire exchange. Ace didn't make promises about what he'd do. He didn't explain how he'd honor Danny's memory. He just said be ready. Richard left. Ace sat back down with his guitar. And he sat there for 20 minutes, just holding Danny's pick, not playing, not moving. When Ace walked onto the Beacon Theater stage that night, he had Danny's worn guitar pick in his pocket alongside his own. Away from the spotlight, Ace made a choice no one expected. The show proceeded normally for the first half. Ace played. The crowd cheered. He moved through his setlist with the precision and power that had made him a legend. When Shock Me came up, Ace pulled out his microphone for the brief announcement he always made before that song. This one's for someone who's not here, he said simply. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out Danny's pick instead of his own. He began to play. The crowd didn't know yet. They couldn't see which pick he was using. They just heard what they always heard. Ace Frehley, making his guitar sound like thunder and lightning, had gotten married and decided to start a band. But Ace knew. And as he played, he thought about Richard's letter. About a 17-year-old kid who'd felt alone and found company in guitar solos recorded a decade earlier. About how music doesn't fix anything, but sometimes it makes the weight bearable. He thought about all the kids like Danny. The quiet ones. The different ones. The ones who didn't fit the mold and found refuge in the space between notes. And halfway through the solo, the part where Danny had been practicing, the section that required precision and confidence, and the willingness to take a chance, Ace felt Danny's pick slip in his fingers. It was worn down. Smooth. Not the sharp pick Ace was used to. For just a moment, his fingers didn't grip right. The note bent slightly off. Most people in the crowd wouldn't have noticed. But Ace noticed. He felt the moment where Danny's pick, after months or years of practicing the same songs over and over, betrayed him. And Ace thought, this is what Danny felt. This moment of almost having it. Almost being there. Almost making the sound match what was in his head. That's when Ace stopped playing. He couldn't continue. Not with Danny's pick. Not knowing that Danny never got to finish learning this song. Never got to play it all the way through without the pick slipping, without the doubt creeping in, without wondering if he'd ever really get it right. Ace set the guitar down. Not in anger. Not in frustration. In respect. Because some things shouldn't be finished by the wrong person. He walked off stage in profile, his face showing the weight of what he was carrying. The crowd didn't understand yet. But Richard Morrison, sitting in the front row with his son's memory, understood immediately. And he cried. Not because Ace had stopped. But because Ace had understood. Subscribe and leave a comment, because some moments only make sense when we remember them together. Backstage, Ace stood in the hallway alone. His tour manager rushed up, confused. Ace, what happened? Are you okay? Do we need a medic? Ace shook his head. Held up Danny's pick. Can't finish it. Not with this. What? The kid who owned this never got to finish learning that song. I'm not going to finish it for him. The tour manager stared at him. Ace, there are 3,000 people out there expecting. They'll understand or they won't. Ace said simply. I'm not going back out. The tour manager started to argue, then saw something in Ace's expression that made him stop. Ace Frehley didn't explain himself. He didn't justify. He just decided, and his decisions carried a weight that made arguing feel like disrespect. What do we tell them? The tour manager asked. Nothing, Ace said. They'll figure it out. In the theater, the confusion was slowly turning into understanding. Richard Morrison's tears had spread like a signal. People around him had started asking questions. Word traveled through rows. Someone had seen Richard talking to Ace backstage before the show. Someone else remembered hearing about the letter. The pieces came together in that collective way that crowds sometimes achieve. They realized this wasn't about them. This show had stopped being a performance and had become something else. A memorial. A moment of respect for someone who wasn't there. The house lights came up slowly. An announcement was made. Due to circumstances, tonight's show will end early. Mr. Frehley thanks you for your understanding. Some people were angry. They'd paid for a full show. They demanded refunds. They shouted that this was unprofessional. But others understood. They stood up and applauded. Not loud. Not demanding. Just a steady, respectful acknowledgement that they'd witnessed something real. Richard Morrison sat in his front row seat long after everyone else had left. A venue staff member approached him carefully. "Sir, we need to clear the theater." Richard nodded, wiping his eyes. "Is there any way I could I give something back to Ace?" "I can ask." 10 minutes later, Ace walked back into the empty theater. Just him and Richard. No audience. No lights. Just two men standing on opposite sides of where music had stopped. Richard held out the guitar pick. "You should keep this." Ace shook his head. "It's your son's. He would have wanted you to have it." What followed silenced everyone in the room. Ace looked at the pick in Richard's hand. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his own pick, the one he'd been planning to use for the rest of the show. He held both picks up side by side. "Your son's pick couldn't finish the song," Ace said quietly. "But he tried. He practiced. He wore this down trying. That means more than finishing ever could." He handed his own pick to Richard. "This one's finished 1,000 songs. Never failed once. But it never tried as hard as your son's did." Richard stared at Ace's pick in his palm. The pick that had played sold-out arenas. That had recorded albums. That had created sounds that millions of people had heard. "I can't take this," Richard whispered. "You're not taking it," Ace said. "I'm giving it. There's a difference." He turned to leave, then paused. "Look back. Your son was right," Ace said. "Being quiet doesn't mean being weak. It means you're listening. Means you're paying attention. Means you know when to play and when to stop." He walked out. Left Richard standing alone in the empty theater, holding two guitar picks that told two different stories about the same truth. Some things matter more than the performance. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The Beacon Theater show became legendary. Not for the music that was played, but for the music that stopped. People talked about it for years. Debated it. Some still insist Ace was unprofessional. Others call it the most honest moment they'd ever seen on stage. Ace never spoke about it publicly. When journalists asked, he'd just shrug and say, "Sometimes you can't finish the song." Richard Morrison framed both guitar picks in his home. Danny's worn pick and Ace Frehley's perfect one. Side by side. A reminder that perfection and effort aren't the same thing, and sometimes effort matters more. Ace kept playing. Kept recording. Kept being exactly who he'd always been, quiet, deliberate, letting the guitar speak when words would just get in the way. But everyone who was there that night understood something that took years for others to learn. Real strength isn't finishing no matter what. It's knowing when stopping is the more honest choice. Ace Frehley taught that lesson without saying a word. Because some truths are too important to be reduced to speeches. They need to be felt. Witnessed. Remembered. And 30 seconds of silence in a theater full of people who finally understood what they were seeing. That's the power of knowing when to stop playing. Years later, when young guitarists asked Ace about technique, about solos, about how to make it in the music industry, he'd sometimes tell them about Danny Morrison. Not as a sad story. As a lesson. "Kids spent months learning one song," Ace would say. "Never finished it. But he tried harder than most people who get paid to play. That's what matters. Not the ending. The trying." He still has letters from parents. From siblings. From people who lost someone and found comfort in knowing that Ace Frehley, who could have kept playing, who could have ignored one stranger's grief, chose to honor it instead. That's not showmanship. That's character. And character doesn't need a spotlight to prove itself. It just needs a moment. One decision. One guitar placed gently on a stage floor. One walk into silence that spoke louder than any solo ever could.